Hello, good people, and welcome back to Unit 10, Lesson 1, Economic Theories, Part 2. We're going to pick up where we left off, right at Keynesian theory. So in our last video, we discussed classical economic theory and kind of what all of that entails, and we just kind of let the economy do what it does. And I did forget to mention just a little something with Adam Smith. He believes, he's a handman. All right, he believes that the government should be hands off of the economy. He also believes in this factor, or this kind of like force type thing that is called the invisible hand. So he thinks that if a company is not bound to survive, does not have a good business plan, is not there to serve the people, and really just does not entice consumers, it is just going to be like backhanded off of the grid, like out of the market. So he thinks that an invisible hand will come and sweep away any competition that is inferior, anybody who is not willing to put out a high-quality product. He believes in very much survival of the fittest, economically speaking. So he believes that the government should be hands-off, and that just kind of the force of competition and just like the general like finickiness of people will lend itself to a higher quality product. So, for example, if we as a group in the United States are like, we don't fool with Applebee's anymore, and we just decide that we don't like Applebee's, they've been around since like forever and ever, amen. However, we don't fool with them anymore. Their business is going to shut down. If consumers decide that the quality of product is not high enough, that business is not going to stay in business. So, like, if you continually put out bad food, you're going to have to fix it, but for people to come back in your restaurant. Okay, that sort of things. He believes in the invisible hand. We've already done pros and cons. Let's scoot over here where we're supposed to be starting. All right, so Keynesian economic, obviously in true binary fashion, is in complete and stark opposition to classical theory. So Keynesian economics says yes to the government helping to fix economic problems. Now, what you consider to be an economic problem also depends on how you view economic theory. So if you're like, yes, a recession is a problem, let's fix it, great. Government jumps right in. Yes, poverty and inequality is a problem. Government, jump in, fix it. Lack of access to health care or dental care or eye exams, yada yada, is a problem. Let's fix it. So the government taking on a lot of the people's problems can be beneficial for citizens. It can also be very difficult for a government to sustain that type of spending for a long amount of money without also raising taxes, because we know fiscal policy is built by Congress and the president, and fiscal policy depends heavily on the balance between government spending and revenue. So how much we spend versus how much we bring in. And you know, because we are a capitalist society and we function off of a market economy, the way that our government receives money, the vast majority of that is through personal income tax from people. So if we're not bringing money in, we can't spend money on programs. So typically Keynesian theory lends itself to higher taxes, kind of beating around the bush, sort of. All right, so whew, gracious. All right, so all four pieces of circular flow, government at the top, banks at the bottom, households on the left, firm on the right, they hold, typically, Keynesian theory, just how it's set up, holds all four pieces of circular flow accountable for fixes. So if the bank doesn't do what they're supposed to do, government can't do what they're supposed to do. If households don't get it together, the firms can't get it together. This, that, and the third. So there's typically less competition within a Keynesian society because the government has eliminated the need for a lot of competition. If government sees that Adam Smith's invisible hand is not working and these businesses have not been like backhanded, slapped off of the map, essentially what you're going to have to do is the government is going to have to come in and be like, all right, we're going to be the high quality product. We are going to provide the high quality product for you. And so there's less focus on competition because there isn't really a need for that. If the government is providing the service for you, it's supposed to be high quality, and you as a consumer can demand higher quality products from your government. That's totally fine, because here in the United States we do have the freedom of petition. Remember, you're allowed to criticize your government, without penalty, in theory. And there's typically more of a focus on an individual rather than profit. So it's more focused on like people rather than profit, which sounds great, except it doesn't necessarily mean that the government is going to give you a high quality of whatever product they're stepping in to try and help you with. All right. Now, typically, people who are Keynesian are influenced by Karl Marx. And if you're like, Marxism, communism, oh no, they're communists. No, not technically, okay? Communism is way more intense than Keynesian economics. People like to refer to Keynesian economics as watered down communism, and they say that in a mean way. That's not really the case. It's more so just whether or not you're okay with the government stepping in to assist in fixing problems, not necessarily shouldering the entire burden of fixing a problem. Now let's get back to Karl. So if you can't remember the difference between Adam Smith and Karl Marx, because real talk, they're both old dead white men, okay? Karl is the communist, okay? Karl the communist. He'd be mad because, no, I'm a Marxist. That's why I gave the economic theory my name. Marxism and communism are not necessarily the same thing. Every time people as a group or like as a country read this manifesto, they're like, yes, we're going to do what he says, except they don't, and they wind up with a dictator, and then communism is typically attached to a dictatorship, historically speaking, and it's a mess. All right. So he believes in this whole thing, this tension, this fight between the proletariat, who are the working class people. These are your factory workers. These are your blue collar people, middle and lower class in our standards, and their struggle against, I don't want to necessarily against, but mostly with the bourgeoisie. Okay, this is a French word, bourgeoisie. This is where bougie comes from, bad and bougie. All right, so he thinks there is a struggle between the working people and the rich people, and he thinks that the workers should rebel, even to the point of violence. Now, I personally do not condone violence. You know how I feel about fighting, all right? However, this is how Karl Marx feels. He thinks that in order to actually topple the system and spread the wealth around to make sure that people are more equal, workers are going to have to rise up and revolt against their rich landowners, against their employers, and force the distribution of wealth. Because typically rich people don't part with their money easily. Rich people tend to be the cheapest because they don't want to lose their money. They want to keep it. I don't know what they're going to do. Sit on it? Have it on their bedside table? I don't know. I'm a teacher. I wouldn't know that. So wealth should be spread equally amongst the people, according to Karl. Now, whether or not you feel the same way, we can totally have a discussion about that. If you've got questions about Keynesian or classical economics, or you have any questions about any other economic theories that you've stumbled across, or you've Googled them and like, I don't know about this. Where does this come from? Just let me know. Send me an email and I'll happily answer. All right, so some pros and cons. There is obviously more distribution of wealth, but sometimes that comes at the cost of everybody being equally poor. So there's typically more focus on the worker, less emphasis on competition, because if you've eliminated the need for competition, you don't have to emphasize it. If your quality control is led by the government, you don't have to worry about it. Wow. I'm making a coughing video instead of a lesson. I'm doing great. All right, so typically people are poor. Regulation can be oppressive. If you do have a lot of government regulation on what can be made, what can't be made, how this has to happen, it can be a little bit oppressive. This can especially happen with like design and stuff like that. Like you have to have an exit sign, and like this giant, beautiful, architecturally great house has to have like an exit sign if it's a business, or has to have like fire extinguishers that don't look pretty. That's probably a very vain example, but regulation can be oppressive sometimes, to the point where like if the government does not allow any sort of competition, then it can be problematic. There's a lower supply typically of all goods and services and quality of goods and services. All right, so we need to talk about some new theories. There's like a bajillion. All right, if you want to talk economic theory, that's fine. We can totally do that. There are no less than 50 major economic schools of thought. Major. There are a whole bunch of minor ones. I'd estimate maybe 150 to 200 economic schools of thought. The way you get to be a major school of thought is if someone who is currently high ranking in the field of academics and economics, or like if you're a renowned professor of economics, or like you've made economic policy for a country or helped develop economic policy or that sort of thing, If you come up with a new way of economic thinking, and other people say that you're legit who teach econ at like a college level or like worldwide, then you're legit. All right, most new theories of economics stem from either liking capitalism and wanting to tweak it a little bit, or disliking capitalism and wanting to throw it out the window. Okay, so they're either adjustments or reactions to capitalism. There is also much debate about socialism. That's my dog. I don't know what she's doing. What are you doing? Stop. Stop. That's weird. What are you doing? All right, so there's much debate about socialism. Typically, in an election year, there's a lot of debate about whether or not the United States has socialist tendencies. There's a lot of debate about whether or not we should move towards a socialist society. And socialism, I would say, is like JV Marxism, like JV communism. If you're like, oh my gosh, that's scary. Not really. It's more so the way that typically progressive candidates nowadays want socialism to be. It's not as scary as people think it is, but people think that socialism is like one step away from communism. It freaks them out because we don't live in a communist society. All right, let's get over to the global economy. So essentially, we're going to be talking about circular flow on a large scale in the next few lessons. We'll have to kind of go back to our unit on macro and like imports versus exports, trade deficits, trade advantages, trade imbalances, and how that can kind of help or hurt an economy. We'll have to talk about like what resources do we have, what organizations can we use in order to make ourselves have an advantage, what things do we have that can be useful to others, how can we do that comparatively. Stop, why are you making that noise? All right, sorry, my dog is just being strange. All right, and then for foreign policy, then we also have to decide, we as a country, who are we willing to trade with? Who are we willing to fool with? Who do we avoid? What are some resources that we need from other countries, even if we don't get along with them? What are some things that we have to have? And like, how does the money flow globally? So then we kind of have to talk about foreign policy and like whether or not we get along with a country and what happens if we don't get along. What tools can we use to manipulate behavior, or should we manipulate behavior in the first place? So we'll get into that in our next couple of lessons, and I think that is all for part 2.